Today, we're going to pull back the curtain on the hidden financial story of World War II. You know, it's not a story about battles and bombs. Nope, this one's about contracts, currency, and, well, how an entire empire wasn't conquered on the battlefield, but was basically foreclosed on. Take a look at this number, $83.2 million. Just let that sink in for a second. What on earth could a payment this specific, made just a few years ago, have to do with a war that ended over 60 years earlier? Well, it turns out that on that day, in a pretty ordinary government office in London, that $83 million payment was the very last installment on a massive debt Britain owed its closest ally, the United States. A debt they took on right after winning the war. And that, right there, is the central mystery we're unpacking today. How did one of the victors of World War II end up in hock for 6 decades, paying for the privilege of its own survival? The answer, as you'll see, reveals one of the greatest transfers of global power in modern history. Okay, so to really get how this all went down, we need to break the story into 6 key parts. We're going to start by uncovering the real price of that victory, which was kind of hidden in the fine print of the loan itself. Right, so that payment in 2006 might have been the final chapter, but our story starts way before that. And the numbers behind it all, well, they reveal a cost that was so much bigger than just 60 years of debt. So the original loan Britain took out back in 1946, it was for $3.75 billion. But thanks to 60 years of interest, by the time they were done, Britain had paid back a total of $7.5 billion. Think about that. They paid back double what they borrowed. But honestly, even that doesn't tell the whole story. Not even close. When you actually add up everything, every asset sold, every naval base leased, every single dollar repaid, the total wealth that moved from Britain to America between 1940 and 2006 was about $450 billion in today's money. To put that in perspective, the entire Marshall Plan to rebuild Europe cost about $200 billion. America got more than twice that amount from its closest ally. So you have to be asking, how in the world did this happen? How did America get so much leverage over what was then the world's largest empire? To figure that out, we've got to go back to the very start of the war, to a time when Britain's greatest strength was also its fatal flaw. In 1939, the British Empire was an absolute titan. It controlled a quarter of the globe. London was the center of world finance, and the pound was king. But it had this one huge critical weakness. It's an island that had to import pretty much everything. We're talking 60% of its food and almost all its raw materials. So Germany's strategy was brutally simple. Cut off those imports, and Britain starves. Now, to fight the war, Britain desperately needed supplies from America, but the U.S. was officially neutral, and they had this policy called cash and carry. It meant, sure, you can buy all the weapons and food you need, but you have to pay for it all up front, in cold, hard cash, and then you have to haul it home on your own ships. No credit, no IOUs. This policy basically created the perfect financial trap. And the effect was just immediate and devastating. Britain started hemorrhaging wealth. First, it shipped $2 billion worth of gold to North America. Then, it literally forced its own citizens to turn over their American stocks and bonds and sold them off for another $1 billion. By December of 1940, less than 2 years in, Winston Churchill sent a desperate letter to President Roosevelt with a very simple message. Britain was broke.
Okay, so this is where the story takes a big turn. America comes up with a new program called Lend-Lease. Publicly, it was sold as this incredible act of generosity. But behind closed doors, the negotiations were absolutely brutal.
President Roosevelt sold the whole idea to the American people with this simple, just brilliant analogy. He said, you don't sell your neighbor a hose when its house is on fire, you lend it to him. It sounded so simple, so neighborly, just helping out in a time of crisis. But the guy running the negotiations, Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau, he saw things very differently. His position was crystal clear. Before America lends Britain a single dime, Britain has to prove it has stripped itself of every last asset it has. This wasn't a neighborly chat over the fence, this was a foreclosure. And the price of this help was steep. Just look at this. Britain was forced to sell a hugely valuable company, American Viscose, for about half its actual worth. Even more important, in exchange for 50 old, obsolete destroyers, Britain had to sign over 99-year leases on its naval bases all across the Western Hemisphere. But the real kicker was hidden in the fine print. See, the Lend-Lease Agreement forced Britain to dismantle something called imperial preference. Now, this was the tariff system that was like the economic glue for the entire British Empire. It created this closed trading club that locked out American companies. For America, getting rid of it was the key to prying open the entire empire for its own businesses. So the war is finally over. You think Britain's nightmare was finished, right? Nope, the financial ordeal was just getting started. In fact, the British Parliament later called the post-war negotiations a financial Munich, basically a complete and total surrender to American economic demands. Just 1 week, 7 days, after the war ended, President Truman cut off all Lend-Lease aid. It was immediate, absolute. Ships that were literally in the middle of the Atlantic carrying food to Britain were ordered to turn around. And just like that, with its entire economy built for war and totally dependent on American aid, Britain became bankrupt overnight. So, in desperation, Britain sends its most brilliant economist, John Maynard Keynes, to Washington. He argued for a grant, calling it a kind of retroactive payment for Britain's sacrifice. But America said no. Instead, they offered a loan. And this loan came with a condition that Keynes knew was a death trap, forcing Britain to make its currency, the pound, freely convertible to US dollars. This meant anyone, anywhere in the world, could trade their pounds for dollars at a fixed rate, no questions asked. And Keynes was exactly right. The second convertibility started, everyone holding pounds rushed to trade them for dollars so they could buy superior American goods. It created a massive run on the pound, draining almost a fifth of the entire American loan in just 35 days. The policy was an absolute catastrophe, and it sealed Britain's financial fate. Now, this wasn't just about knocking down a rival. The tools used against Britain were, at the exact same time, being baked into a brand new global financial system, one that was designed to make sure America stayed on top for generations. You see, even before the war was over, the Allies met at a place called Bretton Woods to design the new world economy. And with Britain totally broke and without any leverage, the American plan won out. The US dollar replaced the pound as the world's reserve currency, and two powerful new institutions, the IMF and the World Bank, were set up right in Washington, D.C. And this really puts the sheer scale of it all into perspective. You know, America is celebrated for giving what amounts to $200 billion today to rebuild Europe with the Marshall Plan. But during that exact same period, it pulled out more than double that amount from its single closest ally. It's just staggering. So let's bring this all home. This story from 80 years ago, it isn't just history. The financial playbook that was used to dismantle the British Empire became a template, a blueprint that is still incredibly relevant today. Just look at this 5-step process. A country has a crisis. The IMF offers a loan, but it comes with strings attached, these structural adjustment conditions. Those conditions force the country to sell off its state-owned companies, power, railroads, you name it, and drop its trade protections. Then, foreign companies swoop in, buy up those assets on the cheap, and the nation gets locked in a cycle of debt. Sound familiar? It's the exact same pattern applied to Britain. Over the last 75 years, the IMF has used this playbook on over 80 countries. What happened to Britain wasn't some strange one-time event. No, it was the creation of a blueprint for economic control through debt. A blueprint that would be used again and again and again. And that really leaves us with a final, pretty tough question to chew on. Britain was a global superpower, an ally that fought and won a war. If this was the price it had to pay, what chance do smaller, developing nations have when they find themselves caught in that exact same financial trap today? If you found this deep dive into the hidden financial story of World War II insightful, make sure you follow and subscribe. We drop new explainers every week that uncover the powerful, often invisible systems that are quietly shaping our world. Thanks for watching.